Octavia never thought twice about the meat she ate. At 69, she had her usual routines: sliced turkey on toast for lunch, a bit of chicken breast for dinner, and sometimes liver stew on Sundays, just like her mother used to make. She lived alone since her husband passed, and food had become more about simplicity and comfort than anything else. No one had ever warned her that these choices, these quiet, everyday decisions, could be quietly working against her. Not her doctor, not her dietitian, not even the dozens of articles she'd read online about healthy eating over 60. Then came the morning her legs didn't feel like her own. It started as a slow ache in her calves, something she chalked up to age or too much sitting. But within weeks, she noticed she couldn't carry her groceries up the front steps without stopping. She blamed it on the weather at first, on the shoes she was wearing, on stress. But deep down, she knew something was changing. Her energy felt drained, her sleep was broken, and her skin looked paler than usual. And then one morning, brushing her hair, she noticed her hand shaking ever so slightly. Her daughter convinced her to go in for a checkup. "Just routine," Octavia had said, brushing it off. But her doctor was concerned. Her blood pressure had crept up, her iron levels were oddly high, and her kidneys were working harder than they should have been. That's when the doctor asked about her diet, not just what she ate, but how often, what type, and where it came from. "Octavia," the doctor said gently, "some of the meats you're eating might be doing more harm than good, especially at your age." She left the clinic confused. How could turkey slices and grilled chicken, the things she believed were healthy, be hurting her? And wasn't liver supposed to be good for iron and energy? That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the light low, staring at the fridge like it was a stranger. She pulled out every meat product, reading the labels she'd never really looked at before: sodium, nitrates, preservatives she couldn't pronounce. It felt like betrayal, like she had been doing her best, and somehow her best wasn't enough. But something changed in her that evening. She didn't panic. She got curious. She started researching, not on blogs, but in medical journals. She asked questions, watched videos, and even joined a small support group for seniors trying to eat better. It wasn't just about cutting things out. It became about choosing better, smarter, more intentional. She learned about meats that could nourish without harming, that could rebuild strength instead of silently draining it away. Meats that helped her feel like herself again, not just older, but wiser and stronger. In the months that followed, Octavia's energy returned, not overnight, but steadily. She started walking her block again without pain. Her sleep deepened, her blood pressure softened, and one day she caught herself singing while cooking, something she hadn't done in years. The difference wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Because for the first time, she felt like she had real control over her health, not just medications or charts. It started with understanding what was hurting her body and choosing what could finally help it heal. Octavia always believed she was doing the right thing. For years, she had carefully avoided fast food, never fried anything at home, and always reached for the healthier options at the grocery store. Her go-to lunch, day after day, was a turkey sandwich. Whole grain bread, a slice of low-fat cheese, a few leaves of lettuce, and of course, her trusted deli turkey. It was quick, easy to chew, and reminded her of simpler times. She never questioned it. Why would she? But things started to change slowly. It began with her ankles. She noticed they were puffier than usual, just a bit at first. Then the tightness in her shoes. Then the weariness, like her legs had bricks strapped to them. Her daughter, Mira, told her it was probably her blood pressure acting up again. So Octavia checked her levels one afternoon, and sure enough, the numbers were high. Probably the salt shaker, she thought. So she stopped salting her eggs, her soups, her popcorn, but the swelling didn't go away, and the tiredness only grew. One morning, her doctor leaned back in his chair and asked her about her diet again. "Still eating sandwiches?" he asked. Octavia nodded. "You might want to look at the label on that turkey," he said, almost apologetically. "Those deli meats are loaded with sodium, even the ones that say lean or low fat. And for someone your age, the kidneys can't flush all that salt like they used to." She blinked. Deli turkey? It had been her go-to for over a decade. Surely something sold in every grocery store couldn't be harmful. But that night, she pulled the pack out of the fridge and read the back. Sodium, over 1,000 milligrams per serving. And there were the words she'd ignored for years: sodium nitrate, phosphate preservatives, carrageenan, chemicals she couldn't pronounce, let alone understand. Her heart sank. Could this really be the reason her legs ached? That her blood pressure danced so wildly? She felt a mix of anger and grief at the packaging, the advertising, the trust she had placed in something so familiar. The next day, she threw out the deli meat, just like that. No fanfare, no debate. It went into the trash, and she stood over the bin a moment longer than necessary, breathing in the silence. She didn't replace it with anything fancy, just a simple roasted chicken breast she seasoned herself, baked with rosemary and garlic. Mira noticed the difference in taste right away. "This is real," she said, chewing slowly. And Octavia, for the first time in weeks, felt like she'd made the right move. It wasn't drastic, it wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. Within weeks, the swelling in her ankles began to ease. Her blood pressure numbers didn't shoot down overnight, but they stopped rising. More than anything, she noticed how her body felt lighter, not just in weight, but in burden, as if her cells were finally exhaling. She didn't need studies or graphs to feel the shift. It was in the way she stood up without holding the table, the way she walked to the mailbox without fatigue trailing her like a shadow. It stunned her to think how long she had been fooled by packaging. Lean, heart-healthy, natural, words that had lost all meaning under the weight of preservatives and hidden salt. She wasn't angry anymore, just awake. Awake to the idea that what she ate didn't just fill her, it shaped her. A sandwich wasn't just a sandwich, and one small shift could be the difference between a body in silent decline and one slowly finding its strength again. Octavia had always felt a sense of safety with chicken. It was what she turned to when red meat felt too heavy or when she wanted something light on her stomach. For years, she grilled it, baked it, and even boiled it when she wasn't feeling well. Boneless, skinless chicken breast, what could be safer than that? It was what every health magazine recommended, what her friends swapped recipes for at book club. Even her doctor once nodded approvingly when she mentioned she ate it most nights. So after tossing out the deli meats, Octavia leaned harder into chicken, 5 nights a week at least. But something strange happened. Even though she had cut back on sodium, her energy didn't come back like she thought it would. She began waking up with tightness in her knees, especially the right one. Walking across her living room started to feel like a slow shuffle, and her sleep, restless. Deep sleep had become a thing of the past. At first, she blamed the weather, or maybe her mattress, but something didn't sit right, especially not in her stomach. She began noticing more bloating, more discomfort after meals. And the worst part? A kind of heaviness she couldn't explain, like her body was tired of something but couldn't tell her what. It was during a phone call with her cousin Lena, a retired nurse in her 70s, that the conversation turned unexpectedly. "What kind of chicken are you eating?" Lena asked. Octavia blinked. "Chicken breast," she said, "the boneless kind, from the supermarket." "Why?" There was a pause. Then Lena's voice lowered. "Is it the cheap kind, packaged in plastic, the kind that always looks too perfect?" Octavia hesitated, then nodded. "I used to think that was the healthiest thing in the world," Lena said, "until my joints started screaming and I realized factory chicken isn't real food anymore." That night, Octavia couldn't sleep. Her mind kept circling around that word, factory. She hadn't thought of it that way before. But once the idea took root, she couldn't unsee it. The chicken she bought was always the same, pale, fattened, vacuum-sealed in plastic, and oddly spongy even before cooking. She remembered once how it sizzled strangely in the pan, almost foaming, but she had ignored it. Because chicken was supposed to be safe, so she started reading. Reports from Europe, studies from American universities. Her eyes widened. Antibiotics in poultry, hormone disruptors, injections of salt water to increase weight, and more than anything, how these factory-processed birds could quietly raise blood sugar in seniors, even without sugar in the meal. It wasn't just calories, it was chemicals, and her body, at nearly 70, couldn't process them the way it once might have. The next morning, Octavia packed up every frozen chicken breast in her freezer and drove to the local co-op. It wasn't cheap. Organic, pasture-raised chicken breasts cost nearly twice as much, but when she saw it, smaller, darker in color, not pumped with brine, she knew she was paying for something real. That night, she seasoned it simply with thyme and lemon, roasted it slowly, and ate it with roasted carrots and wild rice. The flavor was different, richer, and her stomach didn't ache afterward. Over the next few weeks, her joints began to loosen. She could stand without groaning. Her fingers didn't swell in the mornings, and most notably, her sleep started to deepen. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. And that, for her, was everything. One afternoon, while sipping tea with Mira, she shared what she'd learned. Mira had always thought her mom was overreacting when it came to food, but now she was listening differently. "You mean even chicken breast isn't safe anymore?" she asked. Octavia just nodded. "Not the kind that's rushed out of factories. Our bodies know the difference. We just forgot how to listen." That night, as she washed the dinner dishes, Octavia smiled to herself. Not because she had all the answers, but because she had started asking the right questions. Food wasn't just fuel, it was communication, and her body had been trying to speak to her for years. She had just been too trusting, too busy, too conditioned to believe that what everyone else ate must be fine. But now, she was learning, and with every bite of real, clean food, her body was learning too, how to heal, how to rest, and how to be strong again. Octavia always loved dark meat. There was something comforting about the tenderness of a turkey thigh, the richness it brought to her Sunday roasts. In her mind, it was the perfect compromise, healthier than red meat, but more flavorful than the dry chicken breast she'd eaten for years. And besides, it felt familiar. Something about the smell of seasoned turkey thighs baking low and slow reminded her of holidays, of family, of warmth. After cutting out deli meats and switching to organic chicken, Octavia leaned into turkey thighs as her next mainstay. She roasted them twice a week, sometimes with herbs, sometimes with that store-bought garlic marinade she liked. They made her feel like she hadn't given up comfort for health, but comfort can be deceiving. It began subtly. Her ankles, which had just started to return to normal after the deli meat changes, began to swell again. Her blood pressure, once cautiously hopeful, crept back up. Mira noticed it first. "Mom," she said one evening, watching her massage her calves, "didn't your doctor say the swelling was from sodium?" Octavia shrugged. "I haven't touched a salt shaker in weeks." She meant it. She thought she had done everything right. The wake-up call came one morning at the pharmacy. Her prescription for blood pressure meds had to be doubled. "It's probably just age," the pharmacist offered gently, but Octavia wasn't convinced. She had started to feel sharper, stronger, more alert in recent weeks. Why the sudden reversal? Later that afternoon, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the empty plastic wrap from the turkey thighs she'd baked the night before. That garlic marinade she liked? She checked the ingredients: sodium phosphate, potassium nitrate, smoke flavor, sugar. And the turkey itself? Pre-seasoned, vacuum sealed, labeled oven ready. A wave of realization hit her. She hadn't just been eating turkey, she'd been eating an entire cocktail of preservatives and additives, dressed up in herbs and slick packaging. She remembered her doctor's voice from a few months back. "At your age, it's not about fat or calories, it's about how your body handles toxins." And there it was, hidden behind words like flavor enhanced and smoke roasted, was the reason her blood vessels felt tighter, why her kidneys seemed to be working overtime again. Not the turkey itself, but the way it had been treated. Octavia felt a flicker of betrayal. By the labels, by the companies, by the recipes that never mentioned what was in the meat before it hit the oven. But this time there was no despair, just clarity. She cleared her fridge again, every pre-seasoned pack, every marinade bottle, and made a new rule. If she couldn't pronounce it, she wouldn't eat it. She found a local butcher who sold fresh, organic turkey legs and thighs. No seasoning, no smoke, just clean meat. She brought it home, rubbed it with turmeric and rosemary, and roasted it slow, the way her grandmother used to. The first bite tasted earthy, clean, and more real than anything she'd eaten in weeks. And this time, her ankles didn't swell, her sleep didn't suffer, her blood pressure held steady. One evening, Mira stopped by for dinner and tasted the difference. "This is turkey?" she asked. Octavia smiled. "The real kind," she said. And for the first time, that turkey didn't come with bloating, tightness, or foggy sleep. Just nourishment. As she washed the dishes that night, she caught her reflection in the window. There was something steadier in her stance now, something firmer in her voice when she explained to Mira why she only bought unprocessed meats. She wasn't just following instructions anymore, she was reclaiming the knowledge that had been taken from her, buried under years of marketing, shortcuts, and convenience foods. And it wasn't about perfection. She still made mistakes, but now she noticed, she questioned, she listened to her body, and it, in turn, was beginning to trust her again. It had always been called a superfood in her family. Chicken liver, rich in iron, full of vitamins, cooked up with onions and a splash of red wine. Octavia didn't eat it often, just once or twice a week. It was one of those nourishing meals passed down from her mother, especially after long winters or when energy was running low. She grew up hearing that liver was good for your blood, that it built strength. So even as she made changes in her diet, cutting out deli meat, switching to organic chicken, avoiding processed turkey, she still clung to liver. It felt like tradition, like medicine, but the medicine was quietly becoming something else. She first noticed it in her eyes, a faint blur in the mornings that took longer and longer to clear, then the odd nosebleed. Then came the fatigue, not the deep, aching kind she'd had before, but something quieter. A mental fog, like her thoughts were moving through water, her nails had become brittle, and she began to feel an odd discomfort under her ribs on the right side, especially after eating liver stew. At first, she said nothing. She figured she'd been overdoing things. She even blamed her reading glasses. It was during her next blood test that the truth surfaced. Her doctor called her in, furrowing his brow as he flipped through her results. "Your vitamin A levels are high," he said. "Very high," he paused. "Have you been taking supplements?" Octavia shook her head. "No, but I do eat liver once or twice a week." The doctor exhaled slowly. "That explains it." He explained how after 60, the liver, the organ, not the food, becomes slower at processing fat-soluble vitamins like A. And when someone eats liver regularly, they can accumulate more vitamin A than their body can safely handle. It's called hypervitaminosis A. It builds up quietly, and the symptoms mimic aging: blurry vision, fatigue, liver tenderness, dry skin, even bone fragility. Her body hadn't been getting stronger. It had been silently overwhelmed. Octavia felt stunned. She'd thought she was nourishing herself, but in truth, she had been overdosing on something everyone said was healthy. Her mother hadn't known. Her doctor hadn't warned her until now. It felt cruel, almost, like the very thing meant to protect her was quietly doing damage. That night, she opened her freezer and stared at the small container of chicken liver she'd set aside for stew. She remembered cooking it for her husband, spooning it into bowls with mashed potatoes. The memory made her chest ache, but she knew what she had to do. She tossed it. And just like with the deli meat, she stood there for a moment longer, mourning the comfort it once brought, honoring the intention behind it, but releasing it anyway. She didn't stop eating organ meat altogether. Instead, she made a new rule: once a month, not more. And only after checking her iron and vitamin A levels. She told Mira, and Mira raised her eyebrows. "I had no idea too much vitamin A could be dangerous. Neither had Octavia, but now she did, and the knowing felt powerful. Within weeks of removing liver from her weekly meals, the change was noticeable. Her eyes cleared up in the mornings, the pressure near her ribs faded. Her energy, while still a work in progress, felt less foggy. And most importantly, her confidence returned. Not the kind of confidence that comes from doing what everyone else is doing, but the kind that comes from listening to her own body and trusting its signals. She started drinking more water, eating more leafy greens, swapping liver with legumes and roasted mushrooms when she craved something earthy. It wasn't about restriction, it was about restoration. At her next checkup, her doctor nodded approvingly. "You're stabilizing," he said. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Octavia smiled, not because she'd followed a diet, but because she'd learned to question what she once believed without guilt. Even old family habits, even so-called superfoods. In the end, she realized something no one had told her before. Even the healthiest food can become harmful if your body can't keep up with it anymore. And at her age, the goal wasn't just eating right, it was eating right for her. The idea of eating red meat again made Octavia hesitate. For years, she'd avoided it. Too heavy, too fatty, too dangerous, at least that's what she'd been told. Articles warned about cholesterol, friends whispered about heart attacks. Even her old doctor once said, "Better stick to white meat, especially at your age." So she listened, until her hands started to fail her. It began with the teacup. Her favorite porcelain cup slipped right through her fingers one morning, crashing to the floor. She stared down at it, stunned, not by the broken ceramic, but by the unfamiliar weakness in her own grip. Then came the stairs. Pulling herself up with the banister took more effort than it used to. Her knees weren't in pain, but they felt unstable, ungrounded. And one night, while trying to open a jar of soup, she gave up. She simply couldn't turn the lid. Mira had to do it. At her next appointment, her doctor mentioned a term she hadn't heard before: sarcopenia, age-related muscle loss. It's common, he said gently, especially if you're not getting enough of the right kind of protein. You've cut out red meat, haven't you? She nodded. Well, he said, you might be cutting out your body's best chance at building strength. He handed her a brochure on grass-fed beef. Octavia frowned. She had always lumped red meat into one big box labeled bad, but the pamphlet explained how grass-fed beef wasn't just cleaner, but actually richer in anti-inflammatory nutrients, B12, iron, and something called CLA, a fatty acid that helped preserve muscle. The key is moderation, the doctor said. Small portions, twice a week, but the benefits can be real. That night, Octavia sat with the idea. Could it be that she had thrown the baby out with the bathwater? That her fear of red meat had starved her muscles of something essential? Her legs weren't frail, not yet, but they weren't as sturdy as they used to be either. She missed the feeling of strength, the ability to carry groceries, the ease of standing up without a second thought. So she decided to try. She visited a small health store Mira had recommended and asked the butcher for grass-fed sirloin. The man smiled and wrapped a modest cut in parchment, no plastic. 3 ounces is all you need, he said. That evening, she seared the steak gently with garlic and rosemary and served it with spinach sautéed in olive oil. The taste was unfamiliar, deeper, richer, more grounding than the lean turkey and chicken she'd grown used to. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, and after that meal, something inside her shifted. It wasn't immediate, but in the days that followed, she noticed her energy didn't dip in the afternoons. Her hands felt steadier, and by the 3rd week, she could open that same stubborn jar with ease. Mira saw it too. You seem stronger, Mom, she said one afternoon as they walked the park path. Octavia smiled. I feel like I've returned to something, not just food, but wholeness. She wasn't loading up on steak or overindulging, just 2 meals a week, and paired with leafy greens and sweet potatoes, it felt like balance. More than that, it felt like freedom from the false binary of good versus bad, from the fear that every bite might do harm, from the idea that eating well meant constant restriction. Octavia had learned something her younger self hadn't understood. It wasn't about eliminating entire categories. It was about choosing the version that loved your body back. She kept the portions small. She didn't drown it in sauces. And each time she cooked grass-fed beef, she seasoned it with intention, with herbs, with care, and with a quiet appreciation for what it gave her in return: strength, stability, and a sense of self she thought she'd lost. By now, Octavia had rebuilt much of what she thought aging had taken from her. Her mornings were steadier, her blood pressure was under control. She walked with more ease, her grip had returned. But even with all these gains, there was still a soft fatigue that visited her sometimes, like a fog that rolled in quietly mid-afternoon and blanketed her energy. She wondered if it was just part of being almost 70. You're doing better than most, Mira would tell her, and maybe that was true. But Octavia wasn't aiming for better than most. She was aiming for better than before. One afternoon, while browsing the small health market near her daughter's neighborhood, she noticed something unfamiliar in the butcher's case. Dark red cuts labeled grass-fed bison. She tilted her head. Bison? She had never tasted it, never even thought to. But the clerk behind the counter noticed her interest. That's the cleanest meat we sell, he said. It's what I give my dad. He's 82 and still runs errands on foot. Octavia smiled politely but didn't say much. Still, the words lingered. Later that night, she did some reading. What she found surprised her. Bison wasn't just another red meat, it was naturally lean, rich in iron, B12, omega-3s, and a fatty acid she was becoming familiar with, CLA. And unlike beef, it was never factory farmed, no hormones, no antibiotics, no brining, just meat the way it used to be, wild, unaltered, full of the nutrients aging bodies crave. It was even called by some nutritionists nature's multivitamin. She went back the next day and bought just a small piece, enough for one meal. She marinated it with rosemary, garlic, and a touch of olive oil, then grilled it slowly, keeping it rare in the center. The first bite was tender, almost buttery, but not heavy. The flavor was mild, almost sweet. She paired it with steamed broccoli and roasted beets and ate quietly, listening to her body. The next morning, something felt different, not dramatic, but clearer. Her mind was sharper, her body less sluggish. Her face even looked more awake in the mirror. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but as the days passed, the feeling didn't fade. She added bison to her rotation once a week, then twice. Not because she craved it, but because her body asked for it. Mira noticed. "You've been glowing lately," she said one Sunday while they cooked together. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." Octavia nodded. "It's not just what I've removed," she said, "it's what I've found." And that was the truth. All this time, she had been taught what not to eat, but no one had told her what she could embrace instead. What could nourish her without fear, what could build her up, not tear her down. She began talking to others in her age group, at the co-op, in line at the pharmacy, even during her Tai Chi class. She shared her journey not as advice, but as a story, a quiet invitation to pay attention, to listen to their joints, their energy, their digestion, to rethink what they assumed was healthy just because it had been sold that way for years. Her world hadn't become perfect. She still had off days, still had to be mindful. But the foundation was stronger now, not just her muscles or her blood or her bones, but her relationship with food. She no longer feared meals, she welcomed them. And in that small shift, moving from fear to trust, Octavia found the greatest healing of all. And it started not with a diet or a doctor or a lecture, but with a moment in front of her fridge. A decision to question what she'd been told. A choice to swap what was easy for what was real. And in that choice, she didn't just change her meals, she changed her life. Octavia hadn't looked closely at the back of her freezer in months. It was one of those places she rarely thought about, an icy archive of past habits, tucked behind the newer groceries she'd begun buying. The deli meats were gone, the factory chicken tossed, the marinated turkey long forgotten. But this morning, as she reached for frozen spinach, her fingers brushed something familiar, a plastic-wrapped tray. She pulled it forward slowly. There it was, a box of processed chicken sausages. It took her a moment to remember why she'd bought them. Convenience, probably. Maybe it was for that quick breakfast she had planned weeks ago and never made. She flipped the box over. The ingredients list ran long, too long. Words like mechanically separated, sodium erythorbate, and natural smoke flavor. She exhaled. Another food she once trusted. Another trap dressed as health. But it wasn't just about the sausages. It was what the freezer had become, a quiet hiding place for things she didn't want to admit were still part of her life. Old habits, old thinking, just in case, foods, frozen shortcuts from before she started listening to her body. In a single glance, she saw what she hadn't allowed herself to feel. She was still holding on to the past. She stood there for a long time, the cold air wrapping around her like a quiet whisper. Then she did what needed to be done. She cleared it out. All of it. The frozen hash browns with hidden sugars, the processed meatballs, the mystery container she no longer recognized. It all went. Not in a frenzy, not with anger, but with care, as if she was saying goodbye to an old version of herself, one that hadn't known better but had tried her best. Mira stopped by later that afternoon and saw the nearly empty freezer. "Spring cleaning?" she teased. Octavia shook her head gently. "No, just starting fresh." She didn't explain more. She didn't need to. There was something powerful about letting go in silence, a kind of peace that comes from no longer needing to justify change. In the days that followed, she stocked her freezer with intention. Wild-caught salmon, flash-frozen organic vegetables, homemade broth in glass jars, grass-fed ground bison, just the essentials. Just what her body had thanked her for. It wasn't about fear or strict rules, it was about trust. She had learned that what hides in the freezer often reflects what hides in the mind, the compromises, the clinging, the quiet assumptions we don't want to face. By the end of the week, Octavia noticed something she hadn't felt in a long time. Lightness, not just in her joints or her sleep, but in the air around her. Her kitchen felt brighter, her meals simpler, her days clearer. The food she made now didn't just fill her, it honored her, nourished her, gave something back. And it all began with one moment in front of the freezer, one small, quiet reckoning. The kind of shift that doesn't make headlines or get posted online, but the kind that matters, deeply, lastingly, the kind that ripples through the body and eventually through the spirit. Octavia had always believed her cravings were a sign of weakness, a failure of willpower. When she found herself reaching for something salty mid-afternoon or yearning for something rich late at night, she'd scold herself. You just had lunch. You don't need that. For years, she treated those cravings like a bad habit to fight, something to push away. But as her awareness around food deepened, she began to wonder, what if her body wasn't working against her? What if it had been trying to speak to her all along? It happened on a quiet Tuesday. She'd eaten well that day, an egg over greens for breakfast, a small bison burger for lunch, roasted vegetables on the side. She felt nourished. But by late afternoon, something shifted. A familiar restlessness bloomed in her chest. She opened the fridge, then the pantry. Nothing called to her. Then, almost unconsciously, she reached for the salt jar. She paused. Was she really hungry? No. But something inside her was asking for salt. That evening, she brought it up to Mira during their walk. You ever crave something but not know why? Mira laughed. All the time. Chips, chocolate, bread, but I just ignore it. Octavia nodded. I used to do that too, but lately, it feels different, like maybe my body's trying to tell me something I haven't been listening to. Curious, she called Lena, her cousin and retired nurse. What do cravings actually mean? She asked. Lena paused. Depends on the craving. Sometimes salt cravings can mean your adrenals are overworked or your electrolytes are out of balance. Sometimes it's just stress, but either way, it's worth paying attention to. Your body rarely whispers without reason. That stuck with Octavia. Your body rarely whispers without reason. So she began tracking her cravings, not judging them, just noticing. And what she found surprised her. On days when she was more active or spent time in the sun, she craved richer proteins. On days when she skipped hydration, she craved salty foods by 3 p.m. And when she'd had poor sleep, her body screamed for sugar the next morning, not for pleasure, but for energy. The cravings weren't sabotaging her, they were signaling her. She started responding gently instead of resisting. When the salt craving returned, she made a small bowl of bone broth with sea salt and turmeric. Her body relaxed almost instantly. When she felt herself longing for something sweet at night, she roasted carrots with cinnamon and a drizzle of coconut oil. It wasn't about denial anymore, it was about discernment. One night, while sipping her homemade broth, she thought back to how many years she'd ignored these signs, how often she'd blamed herself for bad habits, when in truth, her body had just been asking for balance in the only language it knew. It made her wonder how many other women were punishing themselves for signals they hadn't been taught to read. She brought it up at her weekly tea gathering with a few friends from Tai Chi. What do you all do when you crave something out of nowhere? She asked casually. One woman laughed. I eat it and feel guilty later. Another shrugged. I distract myself. Octavia nodded. I used to do the same, but now I ask why, and it's changed everything. They were quiet for a moment, and then one of them asked, what do you mean? So she shared, not advice, not rules, just the story of how her own body had been whispering for years, and how she was finally learning to listen. That night, as she settled into bed, Octavia realized that this shift wasn't about food anymore. It was about relationship, between her and her body, between her past and her present, between old beliefs and new understandings. For decades, she had treated her body like a problem to manage, but now it felt like a partner, a quiet, steady voice that only wanted to be heard. And she was listening, with love, with curiosity, and at last, with compassion. The truth was, Octavia hadn't slept deeply in years, not since she turned 60, maybe even before. At first, she brushed it off. Everyone her age had sleep problems, didn't they? But lately, even on her better days, she would wake around 2 or 3 a.m., eyes wide open, thoughts racing. Sometimes it was worry, sometimes it was nothing at all. Just wakefulness. And in the mornings, a dull ache settled behind her eyes like fog on the windows. She tried the usual things, lavender sachets under her pillow, no caffeine after lunch, soft music in the background. Some nights helped, but most didn't. She didn't want sleeping pills. She wanted rest that came naturally. The kind of sleep she used to slip into as a girl when her mother would hum in the kitchen and the air felt like velvet. Rest that healed, that stayed. It was Lena again who offered the seed of change. They were talking on the phone one rainy afternoon when Octavia mentioned her sleeplessness. Have you tried lemon balm? Lena asked. Not lemon balm. It's an herb. I used to give it to my patients when nothing else worked. It's gentle but powerful, helps the nervous system exhale. Octavia had never heard of it. Lemon balm sounded like something you'd use in a fancy tea, not something that could help an exhausted mind. But the way Lena spoke about it, softly, confidently, made her curious. That weekend, she found it at the health store in dried form, tucked beside chamomile and valerian. She ran her fingers across the packet. It smelled faintly of citrus and earth, like the garden after rain. That night, she brewed her first cup, just lemon balm and hot water, no honey, no distractions. She sat at her kitchen table, the lights dim, and drank slowly. The warmth curled into her chest like a quiet hand resting over her heart. And for the first time in a long while, she felt her thoughts slow, not disappear, but soften, like waves receding from shore. She slept through the night. At first, she didn't believe it. Maybe she'd just been more tired than usual. Maybe it was a fluke. But the next night and the next, she repeated the ritual. A small cup, no screens, no rushing, just her, the quiet, and the tea. And again, her body responded, not with drowsiness, but ease. As the weeks passed, lemon balm became more than an herb. It became a rhythm, a closing ceremony to her day, a signal to her nervous system that it was safe to release. Her mornings changed too. She woke with more clarity, less pressure in her chest. The fatigue that used to cling to her bones was lifting. Mira noticed it on one of their morning walks. "You're glowing," she said, like something shifted. Octavia smiled. "I've started sleeping," she said simply. Mira blinked. "Seriously?" Octavia nodded. "Like I used to. Like my body finally remembered how." It wasn't magic, it wasn't instant, but it was real. And it reminded Octavia of something she'd forgotten in the rush of quick fixes and loud advice, that nature had always offered medicine, quietly, humbly, without fanfare. And sometimes it came in the form of a leaf. She started sharing lemon balm tea with friends, at book club, at Tai Chi, at the church luncheon. Not as a miracle cure, but as a gesture, a kind of passing of the torch. "Try this," she'd say, handing over a little cloth pouch tied with twine. It helped me rest, and with each cup, with each story, Octavia felt more rooted, more aligned with herself. Food had given her strength, real meats had rebuilt her muscles. But it was this little herb, this overlooked plant, that returned something even more precious: peace. Because healing, she realized, wasn't just about what we chew or avoid. It was also about what we allow, what we soften into, what we let go of. And sometimes it starts with a warm cup in your hands and the courage to slow down enough to receive it. Octavia had grown used to eating by herself. It wasn't sad, at least not always. It was just the way things had become. After her husband passed and Mira moved to the other side of the city, meals gradually became quieter. She still set the table with care, her one blue plate, a folded napkin, her favorite silver fork. But something had been missing, not food, not flavor, but witness. For a while, she hadn't noticed it. She was focused on healing, fixing the meats, rebuilding strength, sleeping better. But now that her body had begun to settle into a rhythm again, she noticed a different kind of hunger, one that didn't start in her stomach. It came to her during dinner one evening. She had made grilled lamb with roasted squash and steamed spinach. It was a lovely meal, nourishing and warm, but halfway through, she set her fork down, not because she was full, but because there was no one to talk to, no one to say, "This is good," or "Try a bite of this." The food was there. The CRM, her health was returning. But joy felt far away. That night, she didn't cry. But she did feel quiet in a way that surprised her. She realized she had spent so much time fixing what was broken inside her body, she hadn't yet asked, "Who do I want to share this with?" The next morning, she picked up the phone and called her neighbor, Etta. They'd exchanged waves for years, chatted briefly about the weather or the mail. Etta was around her age, maybe a little older, and lived alone too. "Would you like to come over for lunch?" Octavia asked. "I'm making soup." There was a pause on the line, then a warm, surprised, "Yes, I'd love that." She made a simple but hearty lentil stew with carrots, turmeric, and a squeeze of lemon, set the table for two, lit a small candle, not for romance or ceremony, but just because it felt right. When Etta arrived, she brought fresh herbs from her garden. "For garnish," she smiled. And something in Octavia softened immediately. They sat and ate slowly, the conversation meandering from childhood to books to aches and dreams. There was laughter, silence, a few shared sighs. The food wasn't the star of the moment, the company was, and Octavia noticed something she hadn't felt in a long time, lightness in her chest, a kind of invisible inflammation she didn't even know was there. Gone. Etta stayed for hours. They brewed lemon balm tea after lunch and moved to the porch to watch the clouds. At one point, Etta reached over and touched Octavia's hand gently. "This was lovely," she said. "It's been a long time since I've eaten with someone without rushing." Octavia nodded. "Me too." That night, Octavia reflected on what had changed. It wasn't the soup. It wasn't even the day. It was the reminder that healing doesn't always happen alone. Sometimes, what the body needs isn't just nutrients, but connection. Not just clean food, but shared presence. From then on, she made it a point to invite someone over at least once a week. Mira when she could, her Tai Chi friend Joan, even young Elena from the co-op, who'd recently lost her mother and seemed to carry a quiet sadness in her eyes. Octavia didn't host lavish dinners, just real food, made with intention, shared without pressure. And she noticed that meals began to taste even better. One afternoon, Mira brought her boyfriend over for lunch. He was gentle, funny, and helped set the table without being asked. As they ate, Mira said, "I didn't realize how healing it can be just to eat slowly, with people." Octavia smiled, her heart full. "We forget," she said, "but the body remembers." Because food, she now knew, wasn't just about strength or sleep or blood pressure. It was about being seen. Nourishment wasn't complete without presence. And while solitude had once protected her, now it was community that carried her forward. Healing had started in her kitchen, but it found its soul around the table. Octavia never set out to transform her life. In the beginning, she just wanted to feel less tired, to stop waking up swollen, aching, and confused by a body that no longer felt like her own. But along the way, through quiet choices, simple meals, and 1,000 moments of listening, she discovered something deeper. She learned that healing doesn't begin with a diet, it begins with awareness, with the courage to ask, what's really behind the foods I eat, with the willingness to let go of habits that once felt safe but were silently holding her back. Swapping processed meats for clean, whole cuts didn't just change her blood pressure, it gave her strength again, real strength, the kind you can feel in your hands when opening a jar, in your knees when you stand without effort, in your heart when you wake up rested for the first time in years. And she realized that healing wasn't meant to happen in isolation. It deepened when she shared meals, when she brewed tea for a neighbor, when she sat across the table from someone and simply said, "Let's eat together." Because the food we choose shapes more than just our bodies. It shapes our joy, our rhythm, our connection to the world. So if you're watching this and feeling tired or lost or just unsure where to begin, let Octavia's story remind you. You don't have to change everything overnight. Start with one bite, one label, one quiet meal made with care. Your body is still listening, it's still waiting to feel safe again, and it will thank you every single time you choose to honor it, because it's never too late to return home to yourself.